I'm Matt Ellman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by me, Matt Ellman. I'm the Professional Learning and Development Manager at Cambridge, designing and delivering training for teachers, institutions and ministries of education around the world. I've worked as a teacher and trainer in the UK, Spain and Malaysia, and I've delivered courses, workshops and talks in around 30 countries. Hello and welcome to another podcast in this series on B2 First for Schools. Today we're going to be talking about encouraging student reflection. Reflection is a word that gets used to refer to many things in language teaching, but today we're using it to talk about how your students can reflect on their progress so far on the course. We're going to be talking about how they can reflect on the exam practice that they do in their lessons, and we'll be talking about the idea of preflection, so setting goals and actually looking ahead rather than looking back. So first of all, it's really important now that we're in the middle of the exam journey that your students are reflecting on how they're doing, that they're taking on the idea of learner autonomy that we discussed in a previous episode and reflecting on what's going well and what they might need to do better. So part of this is about checking in on their visualization, so the idea of themselves on exam day doing really well and thinking about what they might need to improve in order to make that visualization a reality, but also thinking about what they're doing well. It's important to have a balance here and for students to appreciate what they're good at as well as what they might need to work harder on. And there are different tools that they can use to do this. So for example, in Complete, and I'm looking at the B2 First for Schools students book for Complete, after every 2 units, we've got the grammar and vocabulary review. And this reviews the grammar and the vocabulary using exam-style tasks that replicate what students might see in the use of English paper. Students also have the workbook, and this includes not just grammar and vocabulary, but practice of reading, writing, listening as well. So students can really evaluate themselves in terms of all the papers in the exam. Obviously, they're going to get feedback from you, and they'll get feedback from Cambridge One in the tasks that they complete on there, but it's important for them to really think about this and reflect about this themselves to understand what they might need to do better and work harder at. I suggest that you make time for this in your classroom. Otherwise, students lead busy lives, they've got many subjects on the go. We need to carve out a little space, a little bit of time for them to do this during lessons where they can do it in a supported way. Being supported by you, but also being supported by each other, and maybe discussing with a partner where they feel their strengths and weaknesses lie. Because reflection is a skill that needs to be developed. It's not something that just happens, that we can just do straight off the cuff. So make some time for this in your lessons. The second kind of reflection is reflection on exam practice. And this is really, really important. As we go through the exam journey, we introduce more and more exam practice into our lessons. And it makes sense to do that because the exam's getting closer and closer. But what we really want to ensure is that we're not just testing the students again and again and again. That's not going to help them get towards where they need to be. Instead, we want to use that exam practice as a guide to what to work on. So the only way to do that is to have your practice task, and it might be a task from Complete, or it might be an exam practice task that you take from a sample paper from cambridgeenglish.org, or from a practice paper, or from one of our B2 First for Schools trainers. But the key thing is that after doing that task, you are inviting the students to reflect on what they found to be easy about the task. What did they find difficult? How were they approaching the difficult parts? Did they have a process of kind of working through different possibilities to find the right answer, or did they just sort of guess at the end? And they can do this initially on their own. They can answer these questions for themselves. But then it's important, I think, for your students to share their answers together. What happens when students share their answers to these reflection questions is that they can learn from each other how to better approach the task. Even if they don't know the exact right answer, they might learn some strategies or some tips to get to the right answer, or even just to feel more confident about the task itself so that they can perform better in the exam. So it's about making sure that exam practice doesn't just lead to a result, kind of positive or negative result. It actually leads to development of exam technique and some learning as well. That's what we really want to ensure. So one thing that teachers often ask is, how often should they get their students to reflect? And the answer is regularly. So I would suggest maybe doing something every week, or maybe at least every unit of your complete book. The reason it has to be regular is because it takes time to develop the skill of reflection. It's not something that comes naturally to students, or to teachers for that matter. And so it's really important that we build it in frequently so that students are developing the habit. So if, for example, at the end of every unit, you ask your students, what did you find easier about this unit? Which parts did you find more difficult? Why did you find them more difficult? And what do you think you could do over the coming weeks so that you develop those skills and those parts are not so difficult in future? Those are the kinds of questions that will be productive for them. Do you do this already? Maybe it's something that you could add to your classroom. Think about how you could apply this with your students. One resource for exam practice that I really encourage you to check out is Test and Train. And this is included with Complete as part of the digital pack on Cambridge One. Test and Train gives you authentic exam practice. And when it comes to, for example, the reading and use of English papers or the listening papers, you can assign those papers to your students through Cambridge One. They'll complete the papers and Cambridge One will provide the results automatically. And what this means is that you can take those results and you can use your class time then to have your students reflecting on the answers and discussing the answers as a class and really understanding how your students got the answers, whether it's a correct answer or a wrong answer. What was their process of getting there? So the questions your students should be answering in order to reflect are, which part of the task did you find easy? Which part of the task did you find difficult? Why did you find those parts difficult? What was the gap in your knowledge or understanding that made it hard? What was your process or your approach to answering the questions? And finally, what would you do differently next time in order to perform better in the task? Your students can be reflecting first individually and then in pairs or in groups to share their answers, share their strategies for answering these questions so that they can develop their skills as exam takers and not just simply get the right or wrong answer in the exam and leave it there. The final element here of reflection is taking the outputs of reflection, taking students' answers to these reflection questions, and then using that to set goals for the rest of the exam journey. So maybe understanding through a process of reflection that I'm a student and my writing is pretty good, my listening is pretty good, but I really need to work on my speaking skills. I really need to work on the speaking paper. And then thinking about how I'm going to do that over the rest of the course. This is a very individual process. It kind of goes back to what we said in a previous episode about learner autonomy and habits being very personal. The onus is on the student to work out what they need to develop and to find the best way of developing it. And of course, the teacher is a valuable resource that can feed in ideas there. But ultimately, if your students can take ownership of this, they'll be that much more successful. So it's important to consider two things here. What do they actually want to achieve? What do they need to work on in order to improve? But also, how are they going to do it? And again, I recommend that you carve out time in your lessons for students to do this reflection and then to make a plan for how they're going to act on it.
Let's recap.
So in this episode, we've talked about student reflection for 3 different purposes. We've talked about your students reflecting on their progress so far in the exam journey and using different elements of complete to identify what they can do well and what they need to work on. We've talked about reflection as a really important part of exam practice and how exam practice doesn't really have any meaning unless you've got that element of reflection to make sure that it's signposting what your students need to work on. And finally, we talked about pre-reflection and the idea of using your reflection to set goals for the rest of the exam journey. Thinking about what you want to achieve, but also importantly, thinking about how you're going to achieve it. And as teachers, we want to support that process for our students. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And remember, you can listen back to get more tips and tricks throughout the rest of the exam journey. Join me next time. That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/completeconfidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.